All right, I'm excited to start this series where I read memoirs, autobiographies, all that good stuff about certain bands, and then report back to you guys on what surprised me or what blew my mind in this case. I picked up this book called Runnin with the Devil. It's a memoir by their old road manager who turned into their manager eventually. And it really made me think, that old saying, you should never meet your idols? I felt that when I read this book. I just had a whole different perspective of the band afterwards. Because I'm a big Van Halen fan, but I don't know all the deep information about the group. I grew up loving their music, and that's what I'm a huge fan of. So when I read this, it kind of gave me mixed feelings. And it's funny because you can't always take everything as complete fact. It's a memoir from their manager, so it's going to be biased, to favor him looking like the good guy. I realized this when I read Paul Stanley's book about Kiss, and he made some of the other members look terrible. But then I read Peter Criss's book, and it made Paul look terrible. And I'm like, you just have to take it with a grain of salt. I think there's a lot of factual information in this particular book because I haven't heard of anyone in the band suing him or anything for, anything false in the book. So I'm just going to assume it's mostly true unless proven otherwise. But so many things blew my mind about this book, and I want to talk about those points today. I never knew that when Eddie and Alex started out, they were on opposite instruments. So according to the book, Eddie Van Halen played drums and Alex was on guitar. And it's kind of funny how they switched around. And I guess it makes a lot of sense because when I was learning Mean Street, I was talking about how it's a very percussive way of playing, that intro part. So it doesn't really surprise me that Eddie can play drums as well as obviously piano and probably any other instrument. He's probably like Prince. You hand him a flugelhorn and he could probably play anything on it in like an hour. I guess when the band started out, they had different names, just how every band who starts off, they go through different iterations of members and names. My old band, we called ourselves Steel Rage one time. We called ourselves Whiplash. So we were just trying to find something that sounded cool. They had the band named The Broken Combs, which is really interesting. It's very creative. And then the one that killed me was they called themselves the Trojan Rubber Company. So yeah, then they went on to the name Genesis, which we all know was taken by a much bigger band at the time. And then they were called Mammoth, which is kind of surprising, but it makes sense now because, Wolfgang, Eddie's son, now is in a band called Mammoth WVH. And so I thought that was really cool how he brought that name back from the dead, basically, and gave it new life. It was really shocking to me to learn in this book that one of the first tours for Van Halen was opening for Journey. And that Journey had trouble filling the seats. They're relatively new with Steve Perry at the time. So they brought Van Halen in, and that helped ticket sales quite a bit. There's so many great stories about that first tour. And that reminds me, this video that I'm making is not a replacement. It's not supposed to be in the place of reading the actual book. The book is so in depth and I recommend it highly. So be sure you read the book and get the full stories if you're interested. But I like the fact that Journey, was the headliner. And then we had Montrose, which there's a lot of craziness with that too. And they would put all their gear on stage and leave Van Halen with this little tiny bit of stage to work with. It's funny to me now knowing what the band became and just picturing David Lee Roth jumping off the risers and, how energetic Van Halen was. Yet in the beginning, they were constrained to a tiny part of the stage. I learned that Eddie and Alex's mother had some mental issue where she was deathly afraid of Jehovah's Witnesses. And there's a whole story behind that as well. But that was really curious to me to know that they grew up under some pretty interesting conditions. And that led to who they are, who they became, and probably a big part of their success too. If you ever listen to real successful people talk, typically they came from chaos. And they just had to, rise up to get out of that situation. Now, this book didn't go into Eddie and Alex's upbringing too much, but it mentioned a few things about the parents that alluded to the fact that it was an interesting childhood. So the guy who wrote this book, Noel Monk, who's their manager, he talked about how shocking it was to see the brothers fight sometimes. For the most part, they got along, but when they fought, I guess they would scream in Dutch and really go at it, like brothers do. So that in itself isn't that shocking. Brothers fighting, of course, brothers fight. But I always pictured them in my head as being this real solid team when they're in Van Halen because, like they joined forces against David Lee Roth or something. That's just always what I had in mind. So to hear that they would get in scraps like that, it was pretty interesting. I always thought the Brown M&M story was an Ozzy Osbourne thing, where it's in their rider that whoever's in charge of getting things ready for the band had to have a jar of M&Ms, but had to have all the brown ones taken out. It's such a rock star, Axl Rose type of move, right? I guess it was Van Halen. And Noel Monk actually said it was his idea, and he put it in there to make sure that they were detail oriented when they took care of the rider. So, whether it's have a fridge stocked with this kind of beer or whatever, riders can be pretty general and extensive, but to put something in there that's that specific really shows if they did do it that they cared and there's some quality control going on. So it's kind of a high level move if you think about it, even though it really makes them seem like divas. Now, there are a ton of stories about groupies, crazy nights and all this stuff. And I didn't really want to get too far into that because almost every memoir of a rock band has a ton of that. So, of course, Van Halen's one of the top bands for that. But I was surprised to learn that it wasn't David Lee Roth who was getting with the most women. It was actually Alex Van Halen. The only thing that would have been more shocking is if it was actually Michael Anthony who was getting the most women. But it was quite the opposite. I guess he had a pretty steady girlfriend that he was dating since high school. So I think he avoided a lot of that crazy stuff. And when you read this book, you're going to have a new respect, I think, for Michael Anthony in general. Not that it's bad to, be with a bunch of women when you're on tour, but just his demeanor and his calm manner in the band. It seemed like the calm within the storm that was Van Halen back then. This book had a great way of humanizing everyone, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. They were talking about how Steve Perry happened to be in the backstage area with the band. And the band, Noel really makes the band sound very juvenile. And you have to think about how young they were around this time. This was 78, I believe, 1978. They're having a food fight backstage or something. And I guess Eddie Van Halen accidentally hit Steve Perry with a huge wad of guacamole, and it got all over his stage outfit. And so everybody was afraid that Steve Perry was just going to, rage and get really pissed off about it. He went to the bathroom, and I guess Noel had to console him because Steve Perry was actually crying. He was just really sensitive and sad about the whole thing. And that gave me a new appreciation for Steve Perry. He's this giant rock star, but he's got, this sensitive heart, which I believe makes him a great singer, a great musician, because you can really feel that when he I can't speak today, when he emotes his lyrics. Even though it was their first tour, when I think Van Halen, I think of their debut album, one of the best debut albums of anybody of all time. And they were on tour, and when all expenses were taken care of, they were each taking home only about $187 a piece, to play these shows on the tour. And that's really shocking. I know it's original music and you have to work your way up, but I'm in a tribute band and sometimes I make that much just playing other people's music. So to play your own original music, to be on a huge tour like that and to pull in under $200 a show, it just seems so crazy to me. And for a band that toured as much as Van Halen, it was really shocking to learn that David Lee Roth had this fear of flying. So he would get really nervous, especially on the long flights. One time they had to fly to South Africa. And Noel looked over and David Lee Roth was clutching the armrest chair, of the chairs. And that was kind of crazy. And then Eddie Van Halen, I guess, would get homesick, especially early on. And Noel found him, practically crying in the hotel room because he wanted to go home. And that's the thing about the perspective, the bias. I think Noel, made it sound like in the book that he saved the band by talking Eddie into continuing on. But, who knows if that's really true. But that's got to be crazy to see Eddie Van Halen crying because he wants to go home and knowing you have this entire tour that you have to play still. Now, if you picture David Lee Roth, the crazy madman on stage doing karate kicks, jumping up, doing all that stuff, I guess at the end of some of the shows, they would have champagne bottles and he would spray the crowd with them and they would drink and all that. But in one particular show, he ended up just throwing the champagne bottle out into the audience, and I guess it hit this guy in the head. And they made the guy sound like a really tough dude. I forgot where they were. Maybe it was England or something. But afterwards, the guy went backstage and was actually going to beat up David Lee Roth or worse. And Noel, the manager, had to basically pay the guy off so that he wouldn't follow through with that. And I guess even though they did pay the guy off, as they were leaving on the bus, they still had things being thrown at the bus. I don't know if it was beer cans or whatever, but talk about a hairy situation. When you're out of your element, and you're throwing bottles into the crowd, sometimes you have to expect the worst, I guess. I didn't know that Van Halen opened for Black Sabbath as well in their early days. So they're already opening for, Journey, these big bands already. Black Sabbath, they're working with Ozzy. It's so insane to me to picture Van Halen and seeing Black Sabbath in one bill. That must have been just awesome. And according to Noel, Even Black Sabbath was admitting that Van Halen was blowing them away. And that'd be really tough to be a band and have a band like Van Halen opening for you. And what are you going to do afterwards? You know, you've got the best guitar player ever. You've got the flashiness of David Lee Roth and just the tightness of the band and the excitement of the band. Luckily, though, Sabbath fans are diehard, you know, and I guess they still put on a great show even afterwards. They're legends, obviously, so it worked out. But still, I kind of cringe at the idea of thinking of Van Halen opening for my old band. Before Noel became manager, they had another guy that seemed a little bit suspect. Like, he didn't really want to do a lot of work for the band, so he would once in a while show up where they were playing. And one time he wanted to do something big for them because they're, you know, obviously getting very successful. So he invited everybody over and threw this huge party. And at the end of the party, Noel went up to the guy and he was like, "Hey man, thanks for putting all this together. This is great." And the guy actually ended up charging the cost of the entire party, all the food, everything, back to the band. And that's something that Noel talks about. A lot of bands don't realize no matter what you're spending when you're a band, it eventually comes out of your pocket because you have to repay everything. I just thought that was really low to say, "Hey, I'm going to put on a party for you guys. By the way, guess who's paying for it? You." Now, that same manager used to have a video camera. I guess back then it was maybe a Hi8 recorder or something, I'm not sure. And he used to actually record and capture the exploits of the band on tour. And, you know, that could be very damaging if that gets into the wrong hands. You know, all of a sudden it gets leaked to the press or whatever. So this guy's sitting around with a whole bunch of footage of the band being drunk, being X-rated, and concert footage as well. And what this guy did, I don't know what he was on, but he took all the girls from the offices of the record company and sat them all down and basically played the videos for them. So that made the girls really uncomfortable because it was the secretaries, I guess. And I thought, man, what if that happened today and everybody had, you know, smartphones and that footage would be everywhere. So that could have, you know, doomed the band if all of a sudden it got into the wrong hands. But luckily it was way back in the 70s and, you know, it didn't get very far. I'm sure somewhere out there it's in a box, but that's got to be some valuable footage right now. Noel talked about how young and naive the band were, and just like a lot of new bands, they just signed the contract. They didn't really read it over too well, and supposedly they totally kind of screwed themselves over by signing a bad contract in the beginning. Because once they started putting out albums that were selling, they were only making about $1 per album. I think that's what the book said. And at the end of that entire tour, you know, selling all those tickets, selling all those albums, they came home still owing the record company $1.2 million. Now, could you imagine that being a super successful band that's pretty new, you're excited, and all of a sudden you find out that you're in debt for over $1 million. So that's pretty interesting how they fought to overcome that. You'll have to read about that in the book, but it's really interesting. You really have to hand it to David Lee Roth. He's very creative. Not only did he write a lot of the vocal melodies and lyrics, but he thought of really awesome concert ideas. And a big part of it was making a big entrance. And there's a few, you know, stories about crazy entrances. One of them involved a tank. You can read about that. But the one that really got me that's funny. They parachuted. Well, they didn't parachute, but they had 4 guys parachute from an airplane. And obviously, and they landed on the entrance outside of the stadium, but everyone in the stadium could see these 4 guys parachuting down. And then when the guys landed, I guess they got whisked off in a van or something, and the band was wearing the same outfits as the parachuters, and they ran in, so it looked like they jumped out of a plane, there's another pun, and took the stage after that. I thought that was such a brilliant idea, and who could forget something like that? One of the things that really bummed me out about this book is Noel made Eddie Van Halen seem kind of like a dunce in a lot of the stories. And one of them was Eddie met Valerie Bertinelli, and they would soon get married. But when they were preparing for the wedding, there was a girl that Eddie had been with on tour, I guess. She was slapping a paternal suit on Eddie because she said that he got her pregnant. Now, the crazy part, it's going to be hard to describe this in this video, but Eddie had never actually slept with this girl. He never, did the deed with this girl. He did other things, but he never did the deed, something that could get her pregnant. And Noel had to explain to Eddie that, you can't get pregnant by doing those other things, And Eddie seemed really relieved. But all the fear surrounding this litigation, really took its toll on Eddie, and he was supposed to be getting ready for the happiest day of his life. And here he is having to worry about this girl. But that got dropped, obviously. And then David Lee Roth heard about what happened. And he's like, oh man, is there any way I could get insurance so this doesn't happen to me? So he actually asked the manager, Noel, if he could get himself some paternity insurance. And nobody would do it, but Noel thought it would be a good idea to still tell the press that David Lee Roth was insured just in case. I think that could have backfired because that would make people want to come after him because they would know that he had the insurance money to pay off, but whatever, it worked out. David Lee Roth was known to be very emotional. He has some crazy stuff going on up there that also makes him a genius, by the way. But one time Noel got a phone call from the new road manager because Noel had, graduated from being the road manager to the manager. And the new road manager said, hey, David Lee Roth was just going crazy. So we had to put him in a straitjacket. And they had a whole team by this point of security. And I guess it took like 5 guys to put him in the straitjacket. And Noel is like, why did you put him in a straitjacket? That's like the worst thing you could have done. What was Dave actually doing? And the book never really tells you exactly what Dave did to deserve to get into a straitjacket, but you could just imagine. This next fact bummed me out a little bit because, they were riding high on their first couple releases, doing really well. It always went to platinum. But when Fair Warning came out, I guess it came out real slow and people weren't really buying the album the same way they were buying the previous albums. So according to Noel, they had to resort to what's called payola, where you actually pay radio stations to play your songs. And that makes people excited about it. They hear it when they're driving in their car, it becomes familiar. Next thing you know, they buy the album. And the album did go to platinum eventually. But it's kind of a bummer to think that one of the best bands of all time actually had to pay money to get radio stations to play their music. It's just crazy that could happen to a band like Van Halen, especially back then. Eddie sounded like a pretty bad drunk sometimes. They said he could be really likable, lovable, but he could also get really violent. Like he had all these things trapped in himself that would come out when he got drunk or high or whatever. And in this case, I believe he was both. But Noel was walking away after he was talking to Eddie, and out of nowhere, Eddie just like pushed him. And Noel's head actually hit a doorknob and he had to get sent to a hospital that night. It sucks to picture Eddie Van Halen getting that messed up that he pushes his own manager, who, by the way, he got along with for a long time, into a door handle like that. And I guess he felt bad afterwards, but they didn't really talk about it. So it just kind of became this weird thing between them. And that kind of stuff leads to resentments, which we'll find out later in the book, how that all comes to a head as well. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, there were bootleggers everywhere. So there still are, but it's different nowadays with everybody having access to the band as far as being able to record them with their phones. But back in the day, they had people making illegal t-shirts, that weren't merchandised officially from the band. And by the way, Van Halen, according to Noel, it was his idea, decided to do all the merchandising themselves. So they made a lot more money than they would if they gave it to another company to do that. And I guess one of the downsides of doing all your own merchandising is that you also had to enforce it. So they had to hire people, to walk around during their concerts and take down anyone who was selling illegal t-shirts or recordings. Bootlegs of any kind. And I guess a few times they had to get real mean. They had to kind of resort to mob tactics in order to stop this from going on at their concerts. But every time someone's selling an illegal t-shirt, the band is missing out because they're not buying one of their official t-shirts, obviously. So back then they had to do it vigilante style, I guess. Noel talked quite a bit about Eddie being his own worst enemy a lot of the times, whether it was just getting so wasted or drunk or making bad decisions. And one of those bad decisions was that he did not charge anything for doing the Beat It solo for Michael Jackson. I thought that was insane because even if he would have asked for, half of a point, that's how they credit albums on that song, could you imagine how many millions of dollars that would have netted him? And Eddie was just like cool about it. He's like, yeah, I'm just going to do it for Michael. I love that guy. So, I'm just going to give him the solo. It ends up being this gigantic hit. And almost everybody you talk to who's in the guitar world, even outside the guitar world, knows that the Beat It solo is by Eddie Van Halen and it completely kicks ass. It's timeless. But you have to admit he missed out. All he probably would have had to do is just ask Quincy Jones, for half of a point, and it would have been a whole different world for him. But also one time, I guess he got mad and he punched a wall as hard as he could. And the wall in the hotel room was not made out of regular, drywall. It was a brick wall, I guess. And so he ended up not breaking his hand, but he hurt it so bad he couldn't play for 3 concerts. They had to cancel 3 shows. And that's just an example. It's like the most pure example of self-sabotage. I guess David Lee Roth was also a self-saboteur. You could probably imagine he was always doing wild things. But Noel said that Dave was pretty good before concerts. You know, he would save the crazy party stuff till he got on stage or after the show, typically. But for some reason, in the 1983 US Festival, he got completely obliterated before the concert. I don't know why it was different this time, but if you watch the footage from that show, it's hilarious because you could tell Dave is just barely hanging on. He's not doing all his usual, David Lee Rothisms on stage. And he even says a few times, "Oh, I forgot the words." And that's what's great about this book is you could read about a specific time, in this case, a specific show, and then go on YouTube and you could usually find it. And you know what's kind of going on according to what Noel says with the band. And it just brings a different perspective. Now, what really hurt me to read about was the way they treated Michael Anthony. And it was sort of like a pecking order. Like the 3 guys kind of teamed up on him a little bit, ganged up on him, I should say. And when I think of Michael Anthony, I think of this real chill, laid back, smiley guy who's, according to the book, always just happy to be where he was, versus the other guys who seemed really fueled by a different type of fuel, I guess you could say, whether it was just ambition or just a certain drive to get somewhere, where it seemed like Michael Anthony was a little bit more chill about everything. Well, when I think of Michael Anthony, I think of rock solid bass playing and that incredible voice. What is Van Halen without that high harmony singing along? It's not the same band. So it was surprising when all of a sudden, I think it was brought up with Eddie first that, hey, why is Michael Anthony getting the same cut we all are? Because even Noel got 20%, so it was split 5 ways evenly. And it makes me wonder if Eddie would have just taken a point on the Beat It solo, he would have had a lot of money, and this may have not have been an issue. I'm not sure, but I think the chances are a lot better for Michael Anthony if Eddie Van Halen isn't worrying about dollar signs. So I guess during the 1984 tour, their most successful album, they told him that he had to sign a contract to basically waive his rights to getting 20% of what the band made. And it wasn't just for anything from that point on, it was retroactive for that album. So anything that he would make on their most successful album, 1984, was suddenly taken away. And I believe he was just getting the merchandising and probably paid per concert, like you would if you hired a musician to play with your band. And Michael being Michael, I guess he was just kind of whatever. I'm already just happy to be here. I'm happy to make anything. That's kind of the vibe I was getting from this book. So he went along with it. And when I watch him now in concert playing in the 1984 tour, he still looks super excited to be up there. He doesn't look resentful or anything. So you got to hand it to the guy. He's just super zen or something. And the manager, Noel, thought that was a really crappy move for the 3 guys to do to Michael Anthony, but he didn't really step in and do very much. He said if Michael would have come to him, he would have advised him not to sign it. But, the irony of that is that not too long after that, they let Noel go. Pretty much the same kind of thing. All of a sudden I guess Alex Van Halen really didn't want Noel as a manager anymore. So they had a meeting and they just told him he was fired. And he would get nothing from that point on, except he could still book the band, which is a huge slap in the face for a guy who was doing this all these years. And by the way, Noel wasn't on a long-term contract with the band, according to him. He was going month by month, and that's the way the band wanted it. So that if at any time they wanted to let him go, they just had to, wait out the 30 days and they'd be done with him. Now, after hearing all of those things that blew my mind, can you see what I mean by it? It's a bummer, Now when I watch the band, I just feel different. I want to go back almost to the point where I was naive and just, I love Van Halen. But I'm going to have to do this with a lot of bands if I'm going to keep this series going. It's basically going to be a long, drawn-out disillusionment of all my heroes. But maybe that's what I need in order to really get in depth with the people I grew up loving. And in the end, I have to admit that it gives me a new appreciation overall for the struggles a band goes through. And even though I might not agree with how these musicians acted, we all grow over time. I've made a ton of mistakes in my life. And so you kind of have to remember that people are in a growing process. And a lot of these groups, when they're in their heyday, they were super young. Van Halen's a good example of that. So you can't really hold it against them forever. So make sure to check out Noel Monk's book called Runnin with the Devil. I think you're going to find all the stories in it just super entertaining. And I think it's really going to surprise you in a lot of parts. You're going to walk away having a whole new perspective. Okay, thanks again for watching, everyone, and we'll catch you at the next video. See ya. Bye-bye.